The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Book 1, Chapter 1. Subject of the first book. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Many a one believes himself the master of others, and yet he is a greater slave than they. How has this change come about? I do not know. What can render it legitimate? I believe that I can settle this question. If I considered only force and the results that proceed from it, I should say that so long as a people is compelled to obey and does obey, it does well; but that, so soon as it can shake off the yoke, and does shake it off, it does better, for, if men recover their freedom by virtue of the same right by which it was taken away, either they are justified in resuming it, or there was no justification for depriving them of it. But the social order is a sacred right which serves as a foundation for all others. This right, however, does not come from nature. It is therefore based on conventions. The question is to know what these conventions are. Before coming to that, I must establish what I have just laid down. End of Chapter 1, Book 1.
First Book, Chapter 2 of the Social Contract. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. First Book, Second Chapter. Primitive Societies. The earliest of all societies, and the only natural one, is the family. Yet children remain attached to their father only so long as they have need of him for their own preservation. As soon as this need ceases, the natural bond is dissolved. The children being freed from the obedience which they owed to their father, and the father from the cares which he owed to his children, become equally independent. If they remain united, it is no longer naturally but voluntarily, and the family itself is kept together only by convention. This common liberty is a consequence of man's nature. His first law is to attend to his own preservation, his first cares are those which he owes to himself. And as soon as he comes to years of discretion, being sole judge of the means adapted for his own preservation, he becomes his own master. The family is, then, if you will, the primitive model of political societies. The chief is the analogue of the father, while the people represent the children, and all, being born free and equal, alienate their liberty only for their own advantage. The whole difference is that, in the family, the father's love for his children repays him for the care that he bestows upon them, while in the state, the pleasure of ruling makes up for the chief's lack of love for his people. Grotius denies that all human authority is established for the benefit of the governed, and he cites slavery as an instance. His invariable mode of reasoning is to establish right by fact. A juster method might be employed, but none more favorable to tyrants. It is doubtful, then, according to Grotius, whether the human race belongs to 100 men, or whether these 100 men belong to the human race. And he appears throughout his book to incline to the former opinion, which is also that of Hobbes. In this way we have mankind divided like herds of cattle, each of which has a master who looks after it in order to devour it. Just as a herdsman is superior in nature to his herd, so chiefs, who are the herdsmen of men, are superior in nature to their people. Thus, according to Philor's account, the Emperor Caligula reasoned, inferring truly enough from this analogy that kings are gods, or that men are brutes. The reasoning of Caligula is tantamount to that of Hobbes and Grotius. Aristotle, before them all, had likewise said that men are not naturally equal, but that some are born for slavery, and others for dominion. Aristotle was right, but he mistook the effect for the cause. Every man born in slavery is born for slavery, nothing is more certain. Slaves lose everything in their bonds, even the desire to escape from them. They love their servitude, as the companions of Ulysses loved their brutishness. If, then, there are slaves by nature, it is because there have been slaves contrary to nature. The first slaves were made such by force, Their cowardice kept them in bondage. I have said nothing about King Adam, nor about Emperor Noah, the father of three great monarchs who shared the universe, like the children of Saturn with whom they are supposed to be identical. I hope that my moderation will give satisfaction, for, as I am a direct descendant of one of these princes, and perhaps of the eldest branch, how do I know, whether, by examination of titles, I might not find myself the lawful king of the human race? Be that as it may, it cannot be denied that Adam was sovereign of the world, as Robinson was of his island, so long as he was its sole inhabitant; and it was an agreeable feature of that empire that the monarch, secure on his throne, had nothing to fear from rebellions, or wars, or conspirators. Chapter 3 First Book, Chapter 3 of the Social Contract. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. First Book, Third Chapter. The Right of the Strongest. The strongest man is never strong enough to be always master, unless he transforms his power into right, and obedience into duty. Hence the right of the strongest, a right apparently assumed in irony, and really established in principle. But will this phrase never be explained to us? Force is a physical power. I do not see what morality can result from its effects. To yield to force is an act of necessity, not of will. It is at most an act of prudence. In what sense can it be a duty? Let us assume for a moment this pretended right. I say that nothing results from it but inexplicable nonsense. For if force constitutes right, the effect changes with the cause, and any force which overcomes the first succeeds to its rights. As soon as men can disobey with impunity, they may do so legitimately. And since the strongest is always in the right, the only thing is to act in such a way that one may be the strongest. But what sort of a right is it that perishes when force ceases? If it is necessary to obey by compulsion, there is no need to obey from duty; and if men are no longer forced to obey, obligation is at an end. We see then that this word right adds nothing to force. It here means nothing at all. Obey the powers that be. If that means, yield to force, the precept is good but superfluous. I reply that it will never be violated. All power comes from God, I admit, but every disease comes from him too. Does it follow that we are prohibited from calling in a physician? If a brigand should surprise me in the recesses of a wood, am I bound not only to give up my purse when forced, but am I also morally bound to do so when I might conceal it? For, in effect, the pistol which he holds is a superior force. Let us agree, then, that might does not make right, and that we are bound to obey none but lawful authorities. Thus my original question never recurs. Chapter 3.
Book 1, Chapter 4 of the Social Contract. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Book 1, Chapter 4. Slavery. Since no man has any natural authority over his fellow men, and since force is not the source of right, conventions remain as the basis of all lawful authority among men. If an individual, says Grotius, can alienate his liberty and become the slave of a master, why should not a whole people be able to alienate theirs and become the subject to a king? In this there are many equivocal terms requiring explanation, but let us confine ourselves to the word alienate. To alienate is to give or sell. Now, a man who becomes another's slave does not give himself. He sells himself, at the very least, for his subsistence. But why does a nation sell itself? So far from a king supplying his subjects with their subsistence, he draws his from them. And according to Rabelais, a king does not live on a little. Do subjects, then, give up their persons on condition that their property also be taken? I do not see what is left for them to keep. It will be said that the despot secures to his subjects civil peace. Be it so, but what do they gain by that, if the wars which his ambition brings upon them, together with his insatiable greed and the vexations of his administration, harass them more than their own dissensions would? What do they gain by it, if this tranquillity is itself one of their miseries? Men live tranquilly also in dungeons. Is that enough to make them contented there? The Greeks confined in the cave of the Cyclops lived peacefully until their turn came to be devoured. To say that a man gives himself for nothing is to say what is absurd and inconceivable. Such an act is illegitimate and invalid, for the simple reason that he who performs it is not in his right mind. To say the same thing of a whole nation is to suppose a nation of fools, and madness does not confer rights. Even if each person could alienate himself, he could not alienate his children. They are born free men. Their liberty belongs to them, and no one has a right to dispose of it except themselves. Before they have come to years of discretion, the father can, in their name, stipulate conditions for their preservation and welfare, but not surrender them irrevocably and unconditionally, for such a gift is contrary to the ends of nature and exceeds the rights of paternity. In order, then, that an arbitrary government might be legitimate, it would be necessary that the people in each generation should have the option of accepting or rejecting it. But in that case such a government would no longer be arbitrary. To renounce one's liberty is to renounce one's quality as a man, the rights and also the duties of humanity. For him who renounces everything, there is no possible compensation. Such a renunciation is incompatible with man's nature, for to take away all freedom from his will is to take away all morality from his actions. In short, a convention which stipulates absolute authority on the one side and unlimited obedience on the other is vain and contradictory. Is it not clear that we are under no obligations whatsoever toward a man from whom we have a right to demand everything? And does not this single condition, without equivalent, without exchange, involve the nullity of the act? For what right would my slave have against me, since all that he has belongs to me? His rights being mine, this right of me against myself is a meaningless phrase. Grotius and others derive from war another origin for the pretended right of slavery. The victor having, according to them, the right of slaying the vanquished, the latter may purchase his life at the cost of his freedom, an agreement so much the more legitimate that it turns to the advantage of both. But it is manifest that this pretended right of slaying the vanquished in no way results from the state of war. Men are not naturally enemies, if only for the reason that, living in their primitive independence, they have no mutual relations sufficiently durable to constitute a state of peace or a state of war. It is the relation of things and not of men which constitutes war. And since the state of war cannot arise from simple personal relations, but only from real relations, private war, war between man and man, cannot exist either in the state of nature, where there is no settled ownership, or in the social state, where everything is under the authority of the laws. Private combats, duels, and encounters are acts which do not constitute a state of war. And with regard to the private wars authorized by the establishments of Louis IX, King of France, and suspended by the peace of God, there were abuses of the feudal government, an absurd system if ever there was one, contrary both to the principles of natural right and to all sound government. War, then, is not a relation between man and man, but a relation between state and state, in which individuals are enemies only by accident, not as men, nor even as citizens, but as soldiers, not as members of the fatherland, but as its defenders. In short, each state can have as enemies only other states and not individual men, inasmuch as it is impossible to fix any true relation between things of different kinds. This principle is also conformable to the established maxims of all ages and to the invariable practice of all civilized nations. The declarations of war are not so much warnings to the powers as to their subjects. The foreigner, whether king or nation or private person, that robs, slays, or detains subjects without declaring war against the government is not an enemy but a brigand. Even in open war, a just prince, while he rightly takes possession of all that belongs to the state in an enemy's country, respects the person and property of individuals. He respects the rights on which his own are based. The aim of war being the destruction of the hostile state, we have a right to slay its defenders so long as they have arms in their hands, but as soon as they lay them down and surrender, ceasing to be enemies or instruments of the enemy, they become again simply men, and no one has any further right over their lives. Sometimes it is possible to destroy the state without killing a single one of its members, but war confers no right except what is necessary to its end. These are not the principles of Grotius. They are not based on the authority of poets, but are derived from the nature of things, and are founded on reason. With regard to the right of conquest, it has no other foundation than the law of the strongest. If war does not confer on the victor the right of slaying the vanquished, this right, which he does not possess, cannot be the foundation of a right to enslave them. If we have a right to slay an enemy only when it is impossible to enslave him, the right to enslave him is not derived from the right to kill him. It is, therefore, an iniquitous bargain to make him purchase his life, over which the victor has no right, at the cost of his liberty. In establishing the right of life and death upon the right of slavery, and the right of slavery upon the right of life and death, is it not manifest that one falls into a vicious circle? Even if we grant this terrible right of killing everybody, I say that a slave made in war, or a conquered nation, is under no obligation at all to a master, except to obey him so far as compelled. In taking an equivalent for his life, the victor has conferred no favor on the slave. Instead of killing him unprofitably, he has destroyed him for his own advantage. Far, then, from having acquired over him any authority in addition to that of force, the state of war subsists between them as before. Their relation even is the effect of it. And the exercise of the rights of war supposes that there is no treaty of peace. They have made a convention. Be it so. But this convention, far from terminating the state of war, supposes its continuance. Thus, in whatever way we regard things, the right of slavery is invalid, not only because it is illegitimate, but because it is absurd and meaningless. These terms, slavery and right, are contradictory and mutually exclusive. Whether addressed by a man to a man, or by a man to a nation, such a speech as this will always be equally foolish. I make an agreement with you, wholly at your expense and wholly for my benefit, and I shall observe it as long as I please, while you also shall observe it as long as I please. End of chapter 4.
Book 1, Chapter 5 of the Social Contract. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Justin Tovar. The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Book 1, Chapter 5. That it is always necessary to go back to a first convention. If I should concede all that I have so far refuted, those who favor despotism would be no farther advanced. there will always be a great difference between subduing a multitude and ruling a society. When isolated men, however numerous they may be, are subjected one after another to a single person, this seems to me only a case of master and slaves, not of a nation and its chief. They form, if you will, an aggregation, but not an association, for they have neither public property nor a body politic. Such a man, had he enslaved half the world, is never anything but an individual. His interest, separated from that of the rest, is never anything but a private interest. If he dies, his empire after him is left disconnected and disunited, as an oak dissolves and becomes a heap of ashes after the fire has consumed it. A nation, says Grotius, can give itself to a king. According to Grotius, then, a nation is a nation before it gives itself to a king. This gift itself is a civil act, and presupposes a public resolution. Consequently, before examining the act by which a nation elects a king, it would be proper to examine the act by which a nation becomes a nation. For this act, being necessarily anterior to the other, is the real foundation of the society. In fact, if there were no anterior convention, where, unless the election were unanimous, would be the obligation upon the minority to submit to the decision of the majority? And whence do the 100 who desire a master derive the right to vote on behalf of 10 who do not desire one? The law of the plurality of votes is itself established by convention, and presupposes unanimity once at least. End of chapter 5. Recording by Justin Tovar, justintovar.voice123.com. Book 1, Chapter 6 of the Social Contract. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Justin Tovar. The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Book 1, Chapter 6. The Social Pact. I assume that men have reached a point at which the obstacles that endanger their preservation in the state of nature overcome by their resistance the forces with which each individual can exert with a view to maintaining himself in that state. Then this primitive condition cannot longer subsist, and the human race would perish unless it changed its mode of existence. Now as men cannot create any new forces, but only combine and direct those that exist, they have no other means of self-preservation than to form by aggregation a sum of forces which may overcome the resistance, to put them in action by a single motive power, and to make them work in concert. This sum of forces can be produced only by the combination of many, but the strength and freedom of each man being the chief instruments of his preservation, how can he pledge them without injuring himself, and without neglecting the cares which he owes to himself? This difficulty, applied to my subject, may be expressed in these terms. To find a form of association which may defend and protect with the whole force of the community the person and property of every associate, and by means of which, coalescing with all, may nevertheless obey only himself, and remain as free as before. Such is the fundamental problem of which the social contract furnishes the solution. The clauses of this contract are so determined by the nature of the act that the slightest modification would render them vain and ineffectual, so that, although they have never perhaps been formally enunciated, they are everywhere the same, everywhere tacitly admitted and recognized, until, the social pact being violated, each man regains his original rights and recovers his natural liberty while losing the conventional liberty for which he renounced it. These clauses, rightly understood, are reducible to one only, viz., the total alienation to the whole community of each associate with all his rights. For, in the first place, since each gives himself up entirely, the conditions are equal for all, and, the conditions being equal for all, no one has any interest in making them burdensome to others. Further, The alienation being made without reserve, the union is as perfect as it can be, and an individual associate can no longer claim anything. For, if any rights were left to individuals, since there would be no common superior who could judge between them and the public, each, being on some point his own judge, would soon claim to be so on all. The state of nature would still subsist, and the association would necessarily become tyrannical or useless. In short, each giving himself to all gives himself to nobody, and as there is not one associate over whom we do not acquire the same rights which we concede to him over ourselves, we gain the equivalent of all that we lose, and more power to preserve what we have. If, then, we set aside what is not of the essence of the social contract, we shall find that it is reducible to the following terms. Each of us puts in common his person and his whole power under the supreme direction of the general will, and in return we receive every member as an indivisible part of the whole. Forthwith, instead of the individual personalities of all the contracting parties, this act of association produces a moral and collective body, which is composed of as many members as the assembly has voices, and which he receives from this same act its unity, its common self, moi, its life and its will. This public person, which is thus formed by the union of all the individual members, formerly took the name city, and now takes that of republic or body politic, which is called by its members state when it is passive, sovereign when it is active, power when it is compared to similar bodies. With regard to the associates, they take collectively the name of people, and are called individually citizens, as participating in the sovereign power, and subjects as subjected to the laws of the state. But these terms are often confused and mistaken one for another. It is sufficient to know how to distinguish them when they are used with complete precision. End of chapter 6. Recording by Justin Tovar. justintovar.voice123.com.
First Book, Chapter 7 of The Social Contract. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. First Book, Chapter 7. The Sovereign. We see from this formula that the act of association contains a reciprocal engagement between the public and individuals, and that every individual, contracting, so to speak, with himself, is engaged in a double relation, namely as a member of the sovereign toward individuals, and as a member of the state toward the sovereign. But we cannot apply here the maxim of civil law that no one is bound by engagements made with himself, for there is a great difference between being bound to oneself and to a whole of which one forms part. We must further observe that the public resolution, which can bind all subjects to the sovereign in consequence of the two different relations under which each of them is regarded, cannot, for a contrary reason, bind the sovereign to itself, and that accordingly it is contrary to the nature of the body politic for the sovereign to impose on itself a law which it cannot transgress. As it can only be considered under one and the same relation, it is in the position of an individual contracting with himself, whence we see that there is not, nor can be, any kind of fundamental law binding upon the body of the people, not even the social contract. This does not imply that such a body cannot perfectly well enter into engagements with others in what does not derogate from this contract, for with regard to foreigners it becomes a simple being, an individual. But the body politic, or sovereign, deriving its existence only from the sanctity of the contract, can never bind itself, even to others, in anything that derogates from the original act, such as alienation of some portion of itself, or submission to another sovereign. to violate the act by which it exists would be to annihilate itself, and what is nothing produces nothing. So soon as the multitude is thus united in one body, it is impossible to injure one of the members without attacking the body, still less to injure the body without the members feeling the effects. Thus duty and interest alike oblige the two contracting parties to give mutual assistance, and the men themselves should seek to combine in this twofold relationship all the advantages which are attendant on it. Now the sovereign, being formed only of the individuals that compose it, neither has nor can have any interest contrary to theirs. Consequently the sovereign power needs no guarantee toward its subjects, because it is impossible that the body should wish to injure all its members, and we shall see hereafter that it can injure no one as an individual. The sovereign, for the simple reason that it is so, is always everything that it ought to be. But this is not the case as regards the relation of subjects to the sovereign, which, notwithstanding the common interest, would have no security for the performance of their engagements unless it found means to ensure their fidelity. Indeed, every individual may, as a man, have a particular will contrary to, or divergent from, the general will, which he has as a citizen. His private interest may prompt him quite differently from the common interest. His absolute and naturally independent existence may make him regard what he owes to the common cause as a gratuitous contribution, the loss of which will be less harmful to others than the payment of it will be burdensome to him. And, regarding the moral person that constitutes the state as an imaginary being because it is not a man, he would be willing to enjoy the rights of a citizen without being willing to fulfill the duties of a subject. The progress of such injustice would bring about the ruin of the body politic. In order, then, that the social pact may not be a vain formulary, it tacitly includes this engagement, which can alone give force to the others, that whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be constrained to do so by the whole body, which means nothing else than that he shall be forced to be free. For such is the condition which, uniting every citizen to his native land, guarantees him from all personal dependence, a condition that ensures the control and working of the political machine, and alone renders legitimate civil engagements which, without it, would be absurd and tyrannical, and subject to the most enormous abuses. End of chapter 7. First Book, Chapter 8 of the Social Contract. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. First Book, Chapter 8. The Civil State. The passage from the state of nature to the civil state produces in man a very remarkable change, by substituting in his conduct justice for instinct, and by giving his actions the moral quality that they previously lacked. It is only when the voice of duty succeeds physical impulse, and law succeeds appetite, that man, who till then had regarded only himself, sees that he is obliged to act on other principles, and to consult his reason before listening to his inclinations. Although in this state he is deprived of many advantages that he derives from nature, he acquires equally great ones in return. His faculties are exercised and developed, his ideas are expanded, his feelings are ennobled, his whole soul is exalted to such a degree that, if the abuses of this new condition did not often degrade him below that from which he has emerged, he ought to bless, without ceasing, the happy moment that released him from it forever, and transformed him from a stupid and ignorant animal into an intelligent being and a man. Let us reduce this whole balance to terms easy to compare. What man loses by the social contract is his natural liberty, and an unlimited right to anything which tempts him and which he is able to attain. What he gains is civil liberty and property in all that he possesses. In order that we may not be mistaken about these compensations, we must clearly distinguish natural liberty, which is limited only by the powers of the individual, from civil liberty, which is limited by the general will, and possession, which is nothing but the result of force or the right of first occupancy, from property, which can be based only on a positive title. Besides the preceding, we might add to the acquisitions of the civil state moral freedom, which alone renders man truly master of himself. For the impulse of mere appetite is slavery, while obedience to a self-prescribed law is liberty. But I have already said too much on this head, and the philosophical meaning of the term liberty does not belong to my present subject. End of chapter 8. First book, chapter 9 of the Social Contract. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. First book of the Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Chapter 9. Real Property. Every member of the community at the moment of its formation gives himself up to it, just as he actually is, himself and all his powers, of which the property that he possesses forms part. By this act, possession does not change its nature when it changes hands and become property in those of the sovereign, but as the powers of the state are incomparably greater than those of an individual, public possession is also, in fact, more secure and more irrevocable, without being more legitimate, at least in respect of foreigners. For the state, with regard to its members, is owner of all their property by the social contract, which, in the state, serves as the basis of all rights. But with regard to other powers, it is owner only by the right of first occupancy, which it derives from individuals. The right of first occupancy, although more real than that of the strongest, becomes a true right only after the establishment of that of property. Every man has by nature a right to all that is necessary to him, but the positive act, which makes him proprietor of certain property, excludes him from all the residue. His portion having been allotted, he ought to confine himself to it, and he has no further right to the undivided property. That is why the right of first occupancy, so weak in the state of nature, is respected by every member of a state. In this right, men regard not so much what belongs to others as what does not belong to themselves. In order to legalize the right of first occupancy over any domain whatsoever, the following conditions are, in general, necessary. First, the land must not yet be inhabited by any one. Secondly, a man must occupy only the area required for his subsistence. Thirdly, he must take possession of it not by an empty ceremony, but by labor and cultivation, the only mark of ownership which, in default of legal title, ought to be respected by others. Indeed, if we accord the right of first occupancy to necessity and labor, do we not extend it as far as it can go? Is it impossible to assign limits to this right? Will the mere setting foot on common ground be sufficient to give an immediate claim to the ownership of it? will the power of driving away other men from it for a moment suffice to deprive them forever of the right of returning to it? How can a man or a people take possession of an immense territory, and rob the whole human race of it except by a punishable usurpation, since other men are deprived of the place of residence and the sustenance which nature gives to them in common? When Nunez Balboa on the seashore took possession of the Pacific Ocean and of the whole of South America in the name of the Crown of Castile, was this sufficient to dispossess all the inhabitants and exclude from it all the princes in the world? On this supposition such ceremonies might have been multiplied vainly enough, and the Catholic king in his cabinet might by a single stroke have taken possession of the whole world, only cutting off afterward from his empire what was previously occupied by other princes. We perceive how the lands of individuals, united and contiguous, become public territory, and how the right of sovereignty, extending itself from the subjects to the land which they occupy, becomes at once real and personal, which places the possessors in greater dependence, and makes their own powers a guarantee for their fidelity, an advantage which ancient monarchs do not appear to have clearly perceived. For, calling themselves only kings of the Persians, or Scythians, or Macedonians, they seem to have regarded themselves as chiefs of men rather than as owners of countries. Monarchs of today call themselves more cleverly kings of France, Spain, England, etc. In thus holding the land, they are quite sure of holding its inhabitants. The peculiarity of this alienation is that the community, in receiving the property of individuals, so far from robbing them of it, only assures them lawful possession, and changes usurpation into true right, enjoyment into ownership. Also, the possessors being considered as depositaries of the public property, and their rights being respected by all the members of the state, as well as maintained by all its power against foreigners, they have, as it were, by a transfer advantageous to the public and still more to themselves, acquired all that they have given up, a paradox which is easily explained by distinguishing between the rights which the sovereign and the proprietor have over the same property, as we shall see hereafter. It may also happen that men begin to unite before they possess anything, and that afterward, occupying territory sufficient for all, they enjoy it in common, or share it among themselves, either equally or in proportions fixed by the sovereign. In whatever way this acquisition is made, the right which every individual has over his own property is always subordinate to the right which the community has over all. Otherwise there would be no stability in the social union, and no real force in the exercise of sovereignty. I shall close this chapter and this book with a remark which ought to serve as a basis for the whole social system. It is that instead of destroying natural equality, the fundamental pact, on the contrary, substitutes a moral and lawful equality for the physical inequality which nature imposed upon men, so that, although unequal in strength or intellect, they all become equal by convention and legal right. End of chapter 9. End of book 1.